There was a time when Björn Borg seemed almost impossible to disturb. The headband, the long hair, the quiet stare. 5 straight Wimbledon titles, 6 French Open crowns. The kind of fame that made him feel less like a tennis player and more like a figure from another world. For millions of fans, especially those who watched him in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Borg was calm under pressure in a way that hardly felt human. He looked untouched by noise, untouched by nerves, untouched by fear. That is why what happened next felt so hard to understand. By the time Björn Borg turned 26, he was already exhausted in a way that had little to do with his legs or his lungs. He had spent his youth living inside hotel rooms, locker rooms, airports, and stadium tunnels. He had become a global celebrity before most people his age had even begun to understand themselves. He was still a young man, but he had already lived the kind of life that can leave someone feeling much older than the years on paper. The public saw the legend. They saw the champion who won Wimbledon year after year and carried himself with that almost eerie stillness. What they did not always see was the emotional cost of living at the top for so long, so early, with almost no room to be anything other than Björn Borg. In July 1981, Centre Court witnessed one of the defining matches of modern tennis. Borg and John McEnroe met again at Wimbledon, a year after the famous 1980 final that had already become part of sporting mythology. In 1980, Borg had survived that unforgettable 4th-set tiebreak and still found a way to win the match in 5 sets. In 1981, McEnroe got his revenge. He beat Borg in 4 sets and ended Borg's streak of 5 consecutive Wimbledon titles. For many players, losing a final at Wimbledon would have been painful enough. For Borg, the deeper wound may have come from what the defeat revealed. He was no longer certain the hunger was there in the same way. The machine that had carried him through so many long seasons was beginning to slow down from the inside. Only weeks later, he reached the final of the US Open once again facing McEnroe, and again he lost. Borg had reached the US Open final 4 times and lost all 4. That tournament became the one great prize that never fully belonged to him. But it was not just the loss that people remembered. It was what happened after. Borg left before the trophy ceremony. It was an unusual, jarring image. One of the most famous athletes in the world was suddenly gone, as if he no longer wanted to stand there and play the part expected of him. That moment has lingered for decades because it felt like more than disappointment. It felt like withdrawal, like a man quietly stepping back from a life he no longer had the strength to carry. The truth is that Borg's relationship with tennis had already become more complicated than the record suggested. He had conquered the sport so young that there was almost no ordinary growth left to experience in public. He had become rich, famous, admired and studied while still trying to figure out who he was. Every season asked for the same thing: more discipline, more travel, more pressure, more control. And Borg, who had built his name on control, began to lose his desire for the whole structure around it. By early 1983, he was gone from the tour, not slowly fading, gone, retired at 26. It shocked the tennis world because athletes are not supposed to walk away like that. Not when they are still young, not when they still look capable of winning major titles, not when their names still fill stadiums. John McEnroe himself later admitted that he struggled to believe Borg was really done. To many people, it seemed impossible that a man so gifted would leave with so much tennis still in him. But leaving the sport did not mean leaving its shadow. For the public, Borg's career had looked almost perfect. Titles, rivalries, grace, composure, glamour. For Borg himself, the ending was far less tidy. Once the applause stopped, there was no schedule to follow, no match to prepare for, no scoreboard to tell him where he stood. The structure that had organized his entire life disappeared. And when that happens to someone who has been defined by excellence since his teenage years, freedom can feel less like peace and more like emptiness. That is where the real story begins. Because the hardest part of Björn Borg's life was not becoming a legend, it was learning how to live after one. Long before the world knew Björn Borg as the silent champion of Wimbledon, he was a boy who hated losing so intensely that defeat could bring out a very different person. He grew up in Södertälje, an industrial town southwest of Stockholm. Tennis did not enter his life through a famous academy or an ambitious family plan. His father, Rune, won a tennis racket as a prize in a table tennis competition. Young Björn became fascinated by it. When his father eventually gave him the racket, Borg carried it everywhere he could. The game immediately suited something in him. He could spend hours hitting a ball against the family garage door, adjusting the distance, the height, and the force of each stroke. There was no crowd and no applause, just the sound of the ball returning to him again and again. His technique looked unusual. Borg used a powerful Western grip on his forehand and struck his backhand with both hands. Coaches were accustomed to cleaner, more traditional movements. Some believed his strokes would eventually need to be rebuilt. Lennart Berglund disagreed. Berglund, a former French Open champion who later captained Sweden's Davis Cup team, recognized that Borg's style belonged to him. It may have looked awkward to others, but the ball carried heavy topspin and repeatedly dropped inside the court. Berglund understood that changing it could destroy the instinct that made the boy exceptional. Technique, however, was only part of the problem. Borg was not naturally emotionless. As a junior, he could argue, throw his racket and react badly when matches turned against him. His behavior eventually led to a suspension from competition. During that period, his parents took away his racket and refused to let him play. For a child already consumed by tennis, the punishment was severe. Borg could not simply enter another tournament or return to practice as though nothing had happened. He had to confront the possibility that his temper could take the game away from him. When he was allowed back, something began to change. He learned not to show opponents what he was feeling. Anger could remain, but it would no longer control his hands or his decisions. A bad call had to be forgotten. A lost point could not be allowed to damage the next one. Borg gradually built the emotional discipline that later appeared so natural on television. The stillness was learned. That distinction matters because the calm face remembered by millions was not evidence that Borg felt less than other players. It was the result of a young athlete teaching himself to hide what once threatened his career. By his early teens, Borg was defeating players several years older. His speed allowed him to reach balls that appeared beyond recovery. His heavy topspin pushed opponents backward, and his willingness to remain in long rallies placed constant pressure on their patience. He did not need to overwhelm every player with a single spectacular shot. He could make them hit one more ball until they finally missed. At 15, Borg made his Davis Cup debut for Sweden in 1972. Facing Oni Perron of New Zealand, he won a 5-set match and became the youngest player at the time to represent Sweden in the competition. He was still a schoolboy, yet he was already performing in an event filled with national expectation. Later that year, Borg won the Wimbledon junior title. The grass courts that would eventually define his public image were already becoming part of his story. Success arrived quickly after that. So did attention. Sweden had produced accomplished tennis players before, but Borg became something different. His appearance made him immediately recognizable. Long blonde hair fell across his shoulders. His headband framed a face that revealed almost nothing. Young fans followed him through tournament grounds. Reporters searched for signs of emotion that rarely appeared during matches. The greater the attention became, the more Borg protected himself through routine. Berglund helped organize nearly every part of his professional life. Practice sessions were demanding. Fitness became one of Borg's greatest advantages. He developed the endurance to survive long matches on clay, then adapt quickly to the lower bounce and faster rhythm of grass. The contrast between those surfaces defeated many excellent players. Borg learned to dominate both. Yet the same discipline that made his rise possible narrowed his world. His calendar revolved around tournaments. His friendships were shaped by travel. Privacy became difficult. While other young men his age were discovering ordinary adulthood, Borg was learning how to satisfy sponsors, answer journalists, escape crowds, and prepare for opponents who had spent months studying his game. The trophies soon followed. In 1974, at 18, Borg won his first French Open title. He defeated Manuel Orantes after falling behind by 2 sets in the final. The comeback confirmed that the emotional control developed during his suspension was no longer simply good behavior. It had become a competitive weapon. He returned to Paris and won again in 1975. Then came the challenge that many observers believed his game could not solve. Borg's long swings and baseline style appeared designed for clay, not Wimbledon. grass rewarded quick serves, low volleys, and players willing to attack the net. Borg was expected to remain a champion in Paris, but struggle in London. In 1976, he won Wimbledon without losing a set. The boy, once removed from competition for failing to control himself, had become the calmest man in the sport. The transformation looked complete. But there was a cost hidden inside it. Every victory strengthened the expectation that Borg would always remain composed. He could not merely win. He had to continue being the version of himself the world had come to admire. Silent, disciplined, dependable, almost unreachable. For years, that image protected him. Eventually, it became another responsibility he could no longer escape. By the summer of 1976, Björn Borg had solved a problem that many experts believed his tennis could never overcome. He had learned how to win on grass without abandoning the game that made him dangerous. At Wimbledon, the ball stayed low and moved quickly. Serve and volley players attacked before long rallies could begin. Borg had built his reputation from the baseline, using heavy topspin and extraordinary patience. Yet during that tournament, he adjusted his serve, shortened points when necessary, and moved forward with greater confidence. He won the championship without dropping a set. The victory changed the scale of his fame. Winning the French Open had made him a champion. Winning Wimbledon made him an international figure whose image reached far beyond tennis. His long hair and striped headbands appeared in magazines. Teenagers waited outside hotels. Crowds followed him through airports. In Britain, Sweden, and the United States, the quiet young man became one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. The attention was so intense that reporters began calling it Borgmania. For older tennis fans, it can be difficult to explain how unusual that level of celebrity felt at the time. Tennis stars had always attracted attention, but Borg arrived as televised sports were becoming increasingly global. Viewers could follow the same athlete from Paris to London and New York. They did not simply know his results. They recognized his walk, his expression, and the way he bounced the ball before serving. Borg gave them a perfect image. He was young, handsome, disciplined, and almost impossible to read. While other champions argued with officials or released tension through visible emotion, Borg usually turned away and prepared for the next point. The public saw composure. Opponents often felt something more oppressive. No matter how difficult the rally or how loud the stadium became, Borg appeared to return with the same expression. He won Wimbledon again in 1977, defeating Jimmy Connors in a 5-set final. Connors played with aggression and confrontation. Borg absorbed that force and answered with precision. Their contrast gave television audiences exactly what they wanted. Two champions who seemed to represent entirely different kinds of power. Borg returned in 1978 and defeated Connors again, this time in straight sets. He won the French Open that year without losing a set, completing one of the most dominant clay court performances the tournament had seen. In Paris, his topspin pushed opponents farther and farther behind the baseline. At Wimbledon, he adapted to grass with a confidence that no longer looked experimental. He was becoming the player everyone expected to win. That expectation followed him into every stadium. In 1979, Borg claimed his 4th consecutive Wimbledon title after recovering from a difficult final against Roscoe Tanner. Tanner possessed one of the fastest serves in tennis, and his attacking style placed Borg under constant pressure. Borg survived in 5 sets, proving again that his calm was not dependent on matches unfolding comfortably. Then came 1980. By that point, John McEnroe had emerged as Borg's most dangerous challenger. McEnroe was left-handed, creative, emotional, and willing to attack the net at the earliest opportunity. He possessed the touch to redirect the ball from impossible positions and the confidence to confront officials, crowds, or opponents without hiding his frustration. Borg and McEnroe looked like opposites. That contrast made their rivalry irresistible. Their Wimbledon final in 1980 became one of the matches that defined an era. Borg was pursuing a 5th consecutive title. McEnroe was trying to break his control over centre court. The match moved through long stretches of tension before reaching a 4th-set tiebreak that seemed unwilling to end. McEnroe saved multiple championship points. Borg saved set points. The crowd watched the score move deeper into territory, rarely seen in a major final. McEnroe finally won the tiebreak 18-16, forcing a fifth set. Many players would have carried the disappointment into the next game. Borg had come within 1 point of the championship repeatedly, only to lose the set. Yet when the fifth began, his face offered no sign that anything unusual had happened. He held serve. He waited. He continued returning. Borg eventually won the final set 8-6 and secured his fifth straight Wimbledon title. The image of him falling to his knees became one of the rare moments when the emotion inside him escaped completely. But the match also revealed how narrow the distance had become between dominance and defeat. McEnroe beat Borg in the US Open final later that year. The loss added to a frustration that had followed Borg throughout his career. He reached 4 finals in New York, but never won the title. The conditions, the evening sessions, the noise and the hard courts created a different test from Paris or Wimbledon. Borg remained one of the greatest players in the world, yet the US Open became the championship that repeatedly resisted him. The following summer, McEnroe returned to the Wimbledon final and defeated Borg in 4 sets. For the first time since 1975, someone else lifted the trophy on centre court. There was no public collapse. Borg did not throw his racket or argue with officials. He accepted the defeat with the same restraint people had admired for years, yet the result marked a change that statistics alone could not describe. The rivalry had pushed both men. McEnroe later spoke of Borg with deep respect and regarded him as the opponent who brought out his best tennis. Borg also understood that McEnroe represented the future of the game, but the younger American had not simply taken a title from him. His rise arrived at a moment when Borg was already questioning how much longer he wanted to live inside the demands of professional tennis. By then, the champion had almost no private space left. He traveled under constant observation. Fans surrounded him in public. Sponsors wanted access to his name. Journalists interpreted every silence. Tournament organizers expected him to appear, compete, and remain available. His calm image created the impression that he could endure this life indefinitely. The truth was less comfortable. Borg had spent nearly half his life preparing for the next tournament. Victory brought relief, but only briefly. Another event followed. Another opponent waited. Another championship demanded protection. The public saw 5 Wimbledon trophies standing together. Borg increasingly felt the years required to hold them. Retirement did not give Björn Borg the freedom he had imagined. It removed the one structure that had organized almost every day of his adult life. For years, Borg had known where to wake up, when to practice, which opponent waited across the net, and what result would determine whether the week had been successful. Then the calendar became empty. There was no Wimbledon title to defend, no flight to Paris, and no training session demanding his full attention. At only 26, he possessed fame, money, and 11 Grand Slam singles titles. What he lacked was a clear reason to get out of bed the next morning. His marriage to Romanian tennis player Mariana Simionescu ended in 1984. Borg later had a son, Robin, with Swedish model Jannike Björling. By then, however, his private life was moving further from the disciplined world that had once protected him. The man, remembered for controlling every expression, began searching for relief in alcohol, pills, and cocaine. In his memoir Heartbeats, Borg acknowledged that his drug use began in the early 1980s. Cocaine gave him a sensation he compared to the rush he once received from tennis. The feeling was temporary. Each escape left the emptiness waiting for him when it ended. Panic attacks and self-medication became part of years he would later describe with regret. The consequences became frighteningly real. Borg experienced 2 serious overdoses. One brought him to a hospital after a dangerous mixture of alcohol, drugs, and pills. In another hospital room, he opened his eyes and saw his father nearby. Borg later described that moment as a source of profound shame. The boy whose parents had once taken away his racket to teach him discipline had become an adult whose father was watching him survive another collapse. His second marriage to Italian singer Loredana Bertè unfolded under intense public attention and ended in 1993. Business troubles added another form of pressure. Borg had attached his famous name to commercial ventures, but not every project succeeded. At one point, Financial problems placed him close to personal bankruptcy. The trophies remained visible. The certainty they once represented did not. Then in 1991, Borg attempted one of the strangest comebacks in sports history. He grew his hair long again and returned to Monte Carlo carrying a wooden racket, even though professional tennis had moved decisively toward modern graphite equipment. To spectators, he looked like someone trying to recover an image from another decade. The familiar hair and headband were there, but the speed, preparation, and competitive sharpness of the old Borg could not simply be summoned. He lost his first match to Jordi Ariz in straight sets. The defeats continued. Across the early stages of his comeback, Borg struggled even to win a set. Younger opponents had developed in a faster version of the sport, using equipment that generated greater power with less effort. Borg eventually adopted a modern racket and played more competitively, but an official victory never came. His final tour match took place in Moscow in November 1993 against Alexander Volkov. This time, Borg came painfully close. He won the second set and earned a match point in the deciding tiebreak, but Volkov recovered and won. Borg's comeback ended without a single official match victory. It would be easy to remember that return only as humiliation. Yet the attempt revealed how strongly Borg still needed tennis. The sport that exhausted him had also given his life rhythm, identity, and belonging. Returning could not restore his youth, but it reopened a path toward people who understood what he had experienced. Borg began playing senior events with modern equipment. He reconnected with former competitors, including John McEnroe. Their rivalry had once divided tennis audiences, the silent Swede against the explosive American. With age, the tension softened into friendship. McEnroe understood the expectations Borg had carried because he had stood on the opposite side of the net when those expectations were greatest. Stability arrived gradually rather than through one dramatic transformation. Borg moved away from the destructive years and later said he had remained free from drugs for decades. In 2002, he married Patricia Östfeld. Their son, Leo, was born the following year. Leo eventually chose professional tennis, accepting comparisons that neither father nor son could completely avoid. Björn attended matches and offered support, but he did not become Leo's full-time coach. He understood that his son needed a career of his own, not a permanent reenactment of the Borg name. His older son, Robin, followed another path and became involved in sports management. Borg also became a grandfather, entering a stage of family life that the young champion could never have imagined. Then Borg faced an opponent unrelated to fame or competition. In 2023, doctors diagnosed him with an extremely aggressive form of prostate cancer. He underwent surgery in 2024. Later, Borg said he was cancer-free, but he continued returning for examinations every 6 months. The results brought reassurance, never complete certainty. He described his approach simply, living day by day and year by year. At 70, Borg no longer resembles the unreachable young man television audiences remember. He has spoken about addiction, overdoses, failed relationships, poor decisions, fear, and illness. The silence that once made him appear invincible eventually gave way to honesty. His 11 Grand Slam titles explain why Björn Borg became a legend. The decades after them reveal how difficult it was to remain a human being beneath that name. When you remember Borg, do you see the young champion kneeling on the grass at Wimbledon, or the older man who finally found the courage to explain what happened when he stood up and walked away? Subscribe for more stories about the athletes whose most important chapters began after the cheering stopped.